Well, obviously Europe has been in a particularly bad downturn for the last few years, and certainly since the financial crisis of 07-08, we're now actually seeing a real focus on jobs and growth in Brussels. And it's critically important that we actually get growth across the whole of the EU. The Eurozone is a particular problem, but I think elsewhere as well, we need to ensure that we actually get that higher levels of growth. And there's a real focus right now with various projects in Europe, particularly some of the long-term investment projects that Brussels itself is putting in place that should really help us. We've put in place a large amount of legislation over the last few years, and some of that means that bank balance sheets are less available in order to actually support the economic growth that's needed. And so we now need a much more diverse source of funding for our businesses, particularly our smaller businesses. And so I think it's really important that we now actually embrace things like the Capital Markets Union project and make sure that we bring these things on stream as quickly as possible. We have some really great ideas in terms of securitization. To revitalise that market is critical, and we're going to make sure that we actually have a viable capital market across all 28 union countries going forwards. Well, I think we're very preoccupied with implementation. I've referred to much of that legislation. It's still in the making. It's not completed yet. We've got level 2 rules that we're working on. But actually, ultimately, as well as implementation, we're doing reviews. And so we're actually focused on what we have done, looking back, looking at what might need changing, what might need tweaking to make it work better. And those reviews are ongoing. But as well as that, we're looking at the Capital Markets Union as being the big strategic piece of work that we have on our books at the moment in terms of the Econ Committee. I'm actually hoping that everyone embraces it and that we start to have some really positive ideas about how we actually form those capital markets going forwards. Well, it's much easier for me as a politician to go in and argue a particular line if I have evidence and data to back it up. And ultimately, it then isn't my opinion, it's actually data and evidence that's actually doing the talking for me. That's much easier when you're trying to break through 28 countries, and in my case, 650 odd MEPs I have to convince. Well, when I first started in 2009, it was very clear that financial services sector were in crisis, but they actually didn't know how to engage with the European Parliament in particular. As co-legislators, we obviously do have a role at the negotiating table and all the way through the process. And I would have competing vested interests coming to talk to me. So I'd have different banks would come and tell me that the sector as a whole was doing all sorts of things that needed to be regulated, but of course they didn't do it. And so each and every individual firm would have a very different message, often contradicting the person who came to see me before. Now, I have a background in financial services, so I could at least maybe unpick some of those arguments and comments that were being made. But actually, ultimately, it's much better for me if those arguments have already been had indoors within a trade association. So you've already had those arguments between the different banking sectors, between the different buy side, sell side. If they have those arguments first and then come and present a reasoned argument as one body, it's much more valuable for me, because then I don't have to have 20 meetings. I have one meeting. It's always well thought out, it's well prepared. And bearing in mind, most politicians on the Econ Committee don't have a financial services background. The simpler the messaging and the better thought out it is. It really does mean that we're actually working off a much better set of information. Well, as I say, we rely upon external sources of information. By and large, it really is the only source we have. The Commission obviously produced their piece of work, but then step back and don't really assist the members of Parliament in particular to actually gain information. So the only real way we get it is by people coming to lobby us. And that means the last person through the doors is the most important voice, usually. So a trade association coming with a very strong voice, a very strong, simple message, is usually key to the positions that the politicians themselves will take. So the trade body actually being a trusted member of the lobbying community is important, because they will obviously have the first meeting, they'll probably have the last meeting, and they'll probably have the phone call when we're unsure about something, or indeed we're trying to craft our amendments and we need to check something out. So it's one of those things that trust is really important. And I do have a network of people and network of organisations that I trust to give me advice impartially when I actually require it. And I think that only gets built up over time. And ultimately, I think organisations like AFME have really started to build a good reputation in Brussels. I've had a lot of contact with AFME as an organisation, particularly with regards to transparency and how it relates to MiFID and MiFIR. And for me, it's been really important to be able to come to an organisation like AFME and say, we're about to actually take the transparency requirements under MiFID 1 and that apply to equities and apply them to every other asset class. And I need information and data to actually allow us to calibrate that transparency requirement. Do you have a source of information for me? And what became very quickly apparent was that they didn't have a source of information compiled, because all the data was in one individual bank's possession. They didn't share the information. It was very much proprietary. And so AFME very kindly actually agreed to coordinate it. I suspect it was a bigger project than anybody thought it was going to be. But ultimately, we relied upon that information and that data set, not just in the Parliament, but also I understand the Commission and now ESMA have been using that data too. So it's been a critical help to us to actually have that information from a reliable source and where it could be validated externally too. I think they're already making major strides, and part of it is always to come with a very simple, worked-out message to Brussels. Because once you actually come and even stretch a truth and it's caught out, then you undo all of the work that's been done over the last few years rebuilding that reputation. And I think we have to be very careful that building that reputation back up means that they have to be seen to be wanting to be good citizens and adding to the legislative process rather than just having their own personal vested interests at the top of their agenda. I think there are two things here. I don't think that very many people, including many of my colleagues in the political system in the UK, understand the way Europe works in terms of the legislative process. I think they certainly don't understand the interaction between the people who are going to have to implement the legislation and receive the legislation, such as the banks as regulated entities or as the asset managers as regulated entities. I don't think there is a real broad understanding of the process, and there's certainly no understanding of the way in which 28 countries coming together to form one piece of legislation is actually less red tape than 28 countries producing a piece of legislation that then they have to adhere to. So I think the financial services sector get the idea that one piece of legislation from 28 countries is beneficial. And it's not so obvious, I think, to citizens who don't have that interaction as to why it's not just a burdensome process. So I think there's a very big lack of information out there. I'd really like to see a lot more information and a channel to communicate to people a little better as to what Europe is all about, and indeed what not being in Europe would be all about if that were to happen.